everyone. Welcome to today's call. He stressed keeping up during the he were very to Q&A.
So Kabir, you're cutting in and out. I can't really understand what you're saying.
But
Yeah, do you want me to start? Recording is stopped. Are you still there?
can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can.
Okay. I don't know what happened at that point. I will
Yeah,
just
no,
give a quick housekeeping before we start so that people know what to do. So, a quick housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please hold them until the very end. We will have 15 minutes for Q&A session. However, if something urgent comes up or you need my help during the webinar, feel free to type it in the chat section. I will be keeping an eye on it throughout the session. Without further ado, let's begin our today's webinar. And now please join in me in welcoming our special guest speaker. Over to you, Dr. Karen.
Thanks, Kabir. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak to your group today. It's very nice to be able to be speaking on this topic. It has been an interest of mine for quite some time. It hasn't been easy to get funding in this area yet, but we are hopeful, and we do see more need in this area of research for sure. So I'm a research scientist at the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada station in Lethbridge, Alberta. And I have done a lot of work in the past on, well, anything related to cattle welfare. Beef cattle are my expertise. And so we've done a lot on pain mitigation and transport and feeding behavior, anything that can help to improve animal comfort and productivity in the long run. So let me start then. So my presentation today is really giving you an overview of heat stress. And I'm going to start by asking everybody, is it an issue? And my title, Heat Stress, Not an Issue in Canada. I often hear that from people saying, well, we don't really have, the conditions in which you might see heat stress in our livestock. And as I go through this presentation today, I hope I can kind of explain to you why I think we do, and give evidence where we have it, to show you that this in fact is something we should be concerned about. So as I say here, it's typically, heat stress is not typically on the radar of Canadian producers. Some people may have seen some indicators in their animals, but overall, it seems that people don't think it's a big issue. But I guess I will show you today that the impacts of heat stress on production, animal welfare, and economics are highly significant globally, and in Canada and in Alberta as well. So if we look at kind of the national weather data, we can see that the average temperature in 2003, this is from Environment Canada, was almost 3 degrees Celsius above the reference levels calculated between 1961 and 1990. And those values were the second highest since 1948. Also, if you look at the average across, the annual averages increased from overall from up to 2 degrees Celsius, warmer between 1948 and 2023. And you can see that gradual increase in the graph below. So here are the annual temperature departures from that reference value. And where they are red, it shows that they are above the reference value. And where they were below the reference value, they show up as blue. So if we look at the graph, you can see at about 1998 was the last time that the values were actually lower than the reference value. After that point, they've all been higher than the reference value. And this value of 2 degrees warmer is 2 times the global average. So just a reminder, there's actually, when I looked into the literature, because I do remember the heat wave we had in the summer of 2021, and they actually gave it a name. There's papers written about it, and they did call it the Western North American heat wave in the summer of 2021. It was a 2-week period between June 25th and July 7th. During that period of time, Alberta had average air temperatures recorded exceeding 34 degrees Celsius. And in southern Alberta, they were even higher, some reaching 39 for several consecutive days. And at the same time, there was little wind or nighttime cooling. There's other data showing that, during these periods of heat stress, we see that animal deaths are increased. And in that study showed that greater than 650,000 head of farm animals died during that period of time. So another group of individuals looking at climate change data showed that days above 35 degrees Celsius were predicted to increase in Western Canada over the next decade. So you can see that we absolutely have the conditions in which we would consider that animals would fall victim to heat stress. Heat stress is a multifaceted problem. And I mean, obviously it's not just a single, it's not just the weather. We do know that these increased environmental heat loads increase susceptibility of our livestock to heat stress. And we know we have in our feedlots in particular, we raise Angus and Hereford animals, which are cold tolerant animals. That's why they did so well in this country to begin with. But these animals also, because they're cold tolerant, they are almost more susceptible to heat stress. So we have to understand that heat stress is a complex interaction between the environment, the animals, and management factors. And so if we look kind of at in an example scenario, we see that there are rising environmental temperatures in Alberta. We have this prevalence of black-hided and heavy fat animals during our summer months. We have increased feedlot capacity, and you can see that I don't know of many feedlots, at least in the south, are using any type of shade in the feedlots. So there is little or no shade. Often when you drive by a feedlot in the summertime, you might see that they're lying in a line kind of against the porosity fencing where there's kind of that little strip of shade and they're seeking out that shade. You can see that's quite common. So we have to be aware of the environmental conditions, obviously. And so monitoring those weather parameters are important for understanding what the animals experience and the potential for stress that they have. So producers, it would help to be aware of the current and upcoming conditions and to make sure that they can make appropriate management decisions when they see a heat stress event coming. So there are a combination of weather factors that determine how livestock feel their environment, and the 4 are listed there. So the combination of temperature, humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation. And those are the most important factors we need to pay attention to when we're calculating heat stress for animals. There are several different indices already developed. The most common one, and everybody's heard of it, is the temperature humidity index. There's also the wind chill index, which is not important here for heat stress. And then there are others also that are more complex and are understood to provide a more accurate indicator of heat stress. But I think we'll stick with the simple one for now, and one that everybody can use and understand and is widely used and published in the literature. So calculating and using the THI, I've given the formula there on the top of the screen. You can see it's very simple math. An example here, if we look at if the air temperature is 30 degrees and relative humidity is 70%, we can calculate and do the math there, and we get a THI of 81. So this chart is commonly available. You can see it published in many different documents. The Beef Codes of Practice has it, as well as many other things you can find online. So again, if based on our calculation, a THI of 81, if we go across on the chart at 30 degrees and down at 70% humidity, relative humidity, we get that value that we calculated. You can see the graphics in the chart, the colored blocks. So this chart is used as an indicator of what the impact of the heat will be on the animals. So a THI of less than 72 is that light yellow area here is there's no heat stress. Anything above that, there's no heat stress in the animals. THI between 72 and 76 is mild heat stress, so it's this lighter orange. THI between 76 and 80 is the darker orange, it's moderate heat stress, and anything greater than 80 is severe heat stress. That's the red, and dark red is actually indicating mortalities. So in terms of further understanding what thermal stress is and how we look at it and how we can monitor it, everybody I'm sure has heard of the thermal neutral zone for animals and cattle. And that thermal neutral zone essentially is the environmental conditions in which there is no energy or minimal energy for the animal to maintain a constant body temperature. So if you look at the graphic below, this green area here that's the area where the animal expends no energy to just maintain its body temperature. So anything conditions that are above or below, so above, we call it the upper critical limit, and below is the lower critical temperature or limit. And you can see here, I've outlined it in the lighter green. If once the temperatures move beyond that light green box or within that range, the animals start to require energy to maintain that constant body temperature. And beyond that, we get the conditions of hypothermia and hyperthermia, so either cold stress or heat stress. The upper critical temperature can vary by animal type. And so it's been published in the literature that younger animals can have they can withstand higher temperatures, so 27 degrees Celsius, while larger and mature animals, their limit would be put at lower at 24 degrees Celsius. When animals exceed their heat load, it costs between 7 and 25% more energy to maintain that homeothermic level. So there is an energy cost to the animals, and that is often will be reflected in their performance. And so again, it's something that we really need to be aware of. When the animals get to that upper critical limit, heat stress occurs, and essentially it means they can't dissipate the heat from their body effectively. Further, if we look at the normal body temperature in cattle is 38 degrees, between 38 and 38.5 degrees Celsius. It peaks between 3 and 5 hours after the maximum daily temperature, so that would be later in the afternoon, of course. The body temperature, in order for those animals to remain in that thermal neutral zone, is really maintained within a very tight limit of 1 degree Celsius, so 1 degree above or below that normal body temperature. So that's a pretty narrow range, and otherwise, that allows for normal physiological function. And if it goes beyond that, again, the physiological function needs to be changed, as does the behavior of the animal as well. So if we look at what the biggest challenges are for maintaining constant body temperature in cattle, one big one is the heat of fermentation. So when an animal consumes diet, especially high in fiber, the fermentation in the rumen, usually that happens 4 to 6 hours after they have fed, and it accounts for about between 3 and 8% of their total heat production. And this is really due, or in part due to the microbes breaking down the feed in the rumen, and that's the reason for the increase in heat production internally. So heat dissipation can take between or up to 6 hours to occur. So usually that happens during the cooler nighttime hours and cooler nighttime conditions in which they can dissipate the heat. However, if heat dissipation is incomplete, meaning that the overnight temperatures do not allow them to dissipate the heat effectively, they start the next day, and if it's a warm day, they're already starting the next day at above their thermal neutral zone. And so if this happens over consecutive days, this is what we call cumulative heat load in animals. So what are the main causes of heat stress? I'll tell you here that it's not really possible, and I alluded it to before, that it's not really possible to precisely define the temperature of the thermal neutral zone for all cattle. As I said, younger animals, older animals, it may be different. The type of feeder they're on, it really depends on so many things. And so that upper and lower critical temperature will alter depending on these factors. So what are they? They're, again, the combinations. I've said this before, it's complicated because we have to look at all of these factors. So environmental factors, which include temperature, wind speed, humidity, solar radiation. We have animal factors, so the sex of the animal, their hair coat color and thickness, which is associated with their breed, their hide thickness, whether they've been acclimated to these temperatures, whether they are in facilities that have porosity fencing or in open areas, really depends on what type of animal you have. In terms of the management factors, things like windbreaks, shade, sprinklers, muddy pens, whether bedding is used or not, water. So is there enough flow rate, the temperature of the water, is it accessible? So these are all factors that combine in certain ways so that we can control heat stress or that we may see heat stress. Animals can regulate thermally, and once they go beyond that thermal neutral zone, the following 4 processes are really what's used to help them cool down or dissipate the heat. So one way is convection, and that's essentially air movement across the skin. Conduction is by water contact with the skin and transfer of the heat through that process. Radiation is the loss of heat from the body to the atmosphere. So again, that kind of nighttime cooling that we talk about in terms of dissipating the air temperature is lower than their body temperature, so they can dissipate the heat. And then evaporation, so that occurs through respiration, like panting and sweating. In terms of the signs and symptoms, so much of the processes that we've just discussed, you can see them in action in the signs and symptoms of heat stress that you may see in your animals. So essentially, they can respond with a physiological response or a behavioral response to reducing their metabolic heat load. And we do see that animals in confinement are at more risk of heat stress because of the environmental constraints they're in. So obviously, they can't move to a different location for a shade seeking. If there is no shade provided, they're just really at the mercy of what conditions they're under in order to be able to dissipate that heat. If they're on a really black soil, dirt floor that can absorb heat from the environment, that's also a factor that they can't escape. So when passive transfer of heat from the animals to the environment doesn't occur, then that's when we have heat stress, and the symptoms are as follows. So panting is the main mechanism that we see. And it's really evaporative heat loss that we're seeing there. Sweating can occur, but it is more limited in cattle. They use panting more than they would sweating in terms of heat dissipation. You see excessive salivation as in this animal. Their feed intake goes down. They can be lethargic or even restless. They crowd near water or shade. They alter their behavior. So literature has indicated increased standing. They bunch together and they're very agitated. And although you don't see this as a sign or symptom, definitely you don't see it, but it is a symptom. They have peripheral vasodilation that would increase the transfer of heat from their body to the ambient temperature around them. So I have a video here. Hopefully it works and you can see it. This is an example of heat stress. And this video was taken May 28th of this year. It was in the afternoon. The temperature was 29 degrees. Wind speed was 10 degrees and humidity was 28. So I'll play it again quickly. You can see the signs there. Panting is the main sign. They're drooling, salivation. You can see they're bunched together. And it just happens to be, you can see where they're standing. This part of the feedlot is actually the gate closest to the alley, in which there is a bit more airflow than if they stood beside the porosity fencing kind of closer to the back of the pen. So next slide. Oops, sorry. So what are the effects of performance on animals when they're under heat stress? It really depends on the duration and the intensity of that heat stress. So there are many factors here we can look at. There are many papers showing, that's why I've listed them here, the most prevalent things that we see in terms of impacts on performance. So the biggest one is reduced weight gain and feed efficiency. Reductions of up to 10 kilograms over a certain period are seen when energy is needed essentially to, it's diverted away from growth and placed into homeostasis, maintaining homeostasis and maintaining, being able to be in that thermal neutral zone. Reduced reproductive performance, so we see it in both males and females. Spermatogenesis is reduced and the viability of the spermatozoa are also reduced under high heat conditions. And we know that it impairs the functions of establishing and maintaining pregnancy in females. So we have lower conception rates in animals that are continually heat stressed. Also affects milk production. So studies show that 29 degrees Celsius was associated with milk yield reductions by about 23%. And there are several, there are many studies and many different impacts at different temperatures that have been reported. It also increases an animal's susceptibility to disease and metabolic alterations. So we see immune suppression, respiratory issues, ruminal acidosis may increase, oxidative stress is a marker that we can measure that is involved in increased susceptibility to disease. And an example of this is we have seen increased incidence of AIP, or interstitial pneumonia in cattle. The ultimate negative result is extreme, is death in extreme conditions. In terms of the economic impact, well, although there hasn't been any recent Canadian data for beef cattle that I am aware of, I have some values here that they're quite amazing and really should push us to acknowledge that we need to pay attention to this. So estimated annual losses due to heat stress in the US to their animal agriculture, almost 1.7 and 2.4 billion dollars cost. 900 million approximately for the dairy industry, between 900 million and 1.5 million, and for the beef industry 370 million. It's also some estimates coming out of Australian feedlots at about 16.5 million. These studies listed here are about 10 years old, and so they may not really reflect the current economic impacts of heat stress. And particularly with increased average temperatures that I've shown you, the study likely underestimates the economic impact on cattle production, at least in North America for sure. There is some predictions from Canadian climatologists looking at this. They predict a 4 billion annual loss from heat stress to Canadian beef production. And there has been a study looking at dairy cattle in which 90% of the national dairy herd will be fall victim to or experience losses due to heat stress. But we have some, if we're aware, we have some ways to manage it. So we know that animals can acclimate to their environment. They do. Often when we see heat stress, it occurs in the early part of the year, in the spring, when we have the transition. So we have the days from, we may be at 0 or -5, and then all of a sudden you get days that jump up to 20 degrees. And so those animals just do not have a chance to habituate to their surroundings. And that's when we may see those conditions of heat stress even more, when you wouldn't expect that you would get it. I'll be going through a list of strategies and mitigation strategies for heat stress, and it's really recommended that these management strategies are used in combination. And if we use them kind of combined and understand what the conditions are when we're trying to implement them, and they're specific to our region and your operation, it will help to improve the animal's comfort and production overall. So what are the mitigation strategies? The first one I'll talk about is handling. So we know that handling animals can elevate internal body temperature between 0.5 degree and up to 2.25 degrees Celsius. That's really significant. Anytime we've done experiments and we take body temperature, we can easily see it if an animal has just come into the chute, and we take body temperature, and they've been waiting in the handling area or in the crowd tub for any length of time, we take consecutive measurements of body temperature, we see that temperature gradually increasing. What do I mean by handling events? Well, really anytime we handle animals, and that would be for processing, when we're moving them between pens, when we're sorting and weighing them, when we do re-implanting, for breeding, milking, and shipping, loading and unloading for transport. Really, the goal here is to minimize animal movement and only move them and when necessary, if the THI is severe or likely, don't move them at all that day if you don't need to. You can do things like altering your work hours of your employees and the time of the day that the cattle are handled. And it's recommended that, of course, during the coolest part of the day, so working those animals early in the morning before 10 a.m., which is when the heat starts to increase and solar radiation is higher after that point. So it is also recommended that you avoid putting cattle in loading areas for more than 20 to 30 minutes. Again, though in the bunching, that, I guess, unnatural bunching that would happen, it is more difficult for them to dissipate heat. And then restrict handling to only one of these events per day if needed. So you don't process and then start moving the animals a lot between the pens. You choose only one of those. Another mitigation strategy, obviously, is water. And the literature will show that temperatures greater than 27 degrees, cattle require 20 gallons of water for 1,000 pounds of body weight. So if we look at data between winter and summer of water intake and consumption, we see that intake is 87% greater during the summer than in the winter months. So you can see this water trough, which is very typical and usually on the fence line, so it's shared between two pens. on a really hot day, we have to question ourselves as to whether we have adequate space and adequate water flow at those water troughs. Most of, if we look at kind of the older facilities that have been built and now they've the number of pens have been expanded, often producers will put more animals in a pen than they used to, where 250 animals were normal in a pen. Now you can see up to 400 animals in a pen. So I really question whether they're actually receiving enough water. So to accommodate this additional intake, particularly during the summer, we can do things like making sure they have enough linear water tank space. And it's recommended to have between 2 and 4 inches per 1,000 pounds, and to be able to have 5% of the pen being able to be at the water. And I would say that in a lot of cases, we're not meeting that. One thing that would be helpful is to estimate water intake, just so kind of you know what your animals are consuming and what your system flow rate is. So an easy way to do that is just to multiply their dry matter intake by 0.75, and that estimates the number of gallons per head per day. So an example, if you have a dry matter intake of 24 pounds per head per day, a water need is about 18 gallons per head per day. So if you see bunching around the water tanks, that may indicate that the water is limiting factor, because then they're obviously seeking and waiting. I actually watched, we had an experiment in which we were looking at something completely different. And I observed those videotapes, it was during summer, and I observed those videotapes over a week period, 24/7. And I was shocked to see that the water animals were lined up around that water tank for the entire day. It didn't stop during the, kind of it wasn't during peak hours that they would normally just go there. They were there continually 24/7 for the period that I observed. So it tells me that they were not getting enough water during that period of time. Another thing you can do is for larger pens of cattle, you can split them if you have space and you have pen space, to provide additional water tank space and increase water availability. We know that water intake increases throughout the day. So late in the afternoon, and that coincides with rise in temperature during the day. So late in the afternoon, the demand for water is at its maximum. And I would say that that demand is going to be taxing most water supply systems today. Again, considering that a lot of these systems were built many, many years ago, when we didn't have maybe the number of head of cattle in a pen or overall in our feed yards. You have to make sure your water flow is adequate. And so how do you calculate that? What do you look at? Many of you may know what that is. Some of you may have to calculate it. So flow rate, as an example here, flow rate is meant, and we're using that 18 gallon kind of calculation from the 24 pounds of feed per head per day that they consume as an estimate. So an 18,000 gallon, or sorry, 1,800 gallon demand for 100 head of cattle is 75 gallons per hour. That's just calculated by the total demand by the number of hours in the day. And you get a flow rate of 1.5 gallons per minute. So maybe you can calculate, what your system is set up for. And you should actually plan for daily water intake to be met in 6 hours rather than in 24 hours, so that it can manage those peak demands very easily. And if we change it to 6 hours instead of 24, the flow rate needs to be 5 gallons per minute. Other things regarding water, you have to make sure that the water quality is good, and you're regularly cleaning the water troughs, because that will impact their usage. And also total dissolved solids can impact, again, reduce intake and cause toxicity. So I've given some levels there, and this comes from Agriculture Canada in terms of the toxicity levels. So total dissolved solids shouldn't be any more than 3,000. sulfates 1,000 parts per million, nitrite and nitrate at 33 and 45 respectively. Another thing to look for if cattle aren't using the water effectively is to check for stray voltage, because that may also limit water, which it would be very detrimental in conditions of high heat. Some mitigation strategies here. So provide temporary water tanks during peak demand. You can place some of these troughs at the end of the supply lines that are most impacted by the high demand, and place the tanks before the extreme events happen, because the cattle need some time to learn and to learn how to use those troughs. You can see here the picture that I have. Actually, this is taken again just a month ago, and that heat stress animal that I showed you, we did provide extra water tubs. They don't actually drink the water, they actually use it to cool down. So we assumed that they would be drinking it, but they actually are using it more to cool down. Heat stress management survey that was done in 2023 in the US indicated that almost 90% of veterinarians and nutritionists that responded to the survey recommended that you add water tanks during extreme heat. But in the same survey showed that only 36% of feedlot managers responding to the survey said that they would put extra water troughs there. And some of the reasons why they didn't didn't do it are labor, time, availability, and cost of the extra tanks. So another mitigation strategy, we can look at feed and feeding. And I think most people are aware and practice this to some extent. We can alter feeding strategies, and as far as when we feed them, the volume of feed and the frequency that we feed them, the dietary energy level, and certain feed additives may help. So if we look at that list, there's no initial direct cost to doing these. But we may have to alter ingredient use, and it may impact storage and labor, which can impact operational efficiencies. Approximately 30% of feedlot managers in the US at least were adjusting their feed delivery schedules in the summer. And that alteration really meant that they were delivering feed later in the day, and that allows cattle to shift their metabolic load to the evening hours when the temperatures are lower. It makes sense in that they can dissipate heat during that time. Cattle compensate themselves, not essentially voluntarily. In hot conditions, they consume smaller, more frequent meals and shift to the cooler parts of the day. So that happens within the animal itself. They make those changes. And that their voluntary intake has been shown to start declining at about 25 degrees Celsius, in that kind of range, 25 to 27 degrees Celsius. The temperature at which dry matter declines is influenced by many, many things. And again, it goes back to this multifaceted issue. So, for example, a diet that has high roughage, they can exhibit increased reductions of dry matter intake because the heat of fermentation is higher. Things like the breed and production, health status, body condition, and days on feed can all impact that. Impacts of feeding toxins unknowingly or knowingly. If you have ergot contaminated grain, for example, ergot is a fungal infection that it's occurring in cereal grains on the prairies, and it has been increasing in its prevalence over the last 20 years, and particularly with increased heat and kind of patterns of high heat and or high moisture conditions, it is increasing. So we actually have a study. Gabriel Ribeiro is the principal lead on this project. He's at U of S. He's a nutritionist at U of S. And this is in collaboration with Kim Stanford, Dr. Kim Stanford at University of Lethbridge, myself, and Tim McAllister, looking at the effects of feeding ergot on beef cattle. It was funded jointly by BCRC, Ag Canada, and ARDAR. And just to go over quickly, there you see a pail of ergot infested barley. You can see the sclerotia, or the bodies, the pathogenic bodies produced by the plant, and they turn out to be these dark kernels that you can easily see in a bucket of grain. The treatments, we conducted several studies over the last 7 years. This particular study that I'll be talking about today is happening currently. The treatments that we have are a control group that they're fed no ergot. We have a group that's fed ergot continuously at 2 parts per million in the diet. We have a group that's fed intermittently at 2 parts per million. And then on top of that, we have added a ergot binder, which essentially deactivates the toxin or the alkaloids within the ergot. And we have a factorial design there where continuous and intermittent with and without the ergot binder. So I just want to show you some videos that we've taken from these animals. And I want you to think, when I play the video, what group did this animal belong to? You can see the panting, you can see the salivation. They're trying to stand in more open fenced areas. Well, that just turns out to be, and it makes sense, that it's the continuously fed ergot group with no binding added to their diet, no binder to deactivate the ergot. Here's another video. I'll let you look at it and you can tell or guess which treatment it is. You can see the animals panting, that one's standing, and again, usually by the gate, there's bunching in the corner. So that just happened to be the continuously fed ergot group plus binder. So not all the animals, we do see some impacts of the binder, and the study is not over yet, but it appears that it is working somewhat. We don't see as great a symptoms as we do with the continuously fed ergot group with no binder. So here's another video as well. I'll let you look and you can guess which treatment it is. And that is the continuously fed ergot group with no binder. So again, you can see there's lots of indicators of panting and standing, bunching. They're standing near the open gate, similar to the other groups that we saw. And just one last video here. And that group has a binder, and you can see that although you do see some, it's continuously fed ergot with the binder, you can still see some signs, but they're not as severe as just the ergot only group. And so we do see some impacts on the binder. We do see some impacts on definitely on performance is reduced in the ergot only group. The binder seems to also, there's some tendencies for higher weight gain in the binder group. So here we go on to other mitigation strategies. Shade is another one. We've often heard of it, and I don't know that many of our feedlots or systems incorporate any kind of shade at this time. Very few, if there are. The goal here is to reduce heat accumulation from solar radiation on the animals as well as on the pen floor. And that can be up to 30%. Numerous studies show shade can reduce the physiological responses. So the things that we've seen, the panting score, respiration, and temperature, increased performance is also associated with use of shade. So body weight, average daily gain, dry matter intake, and feed efficiency. And also there are positive effects on behavior. So increased lying, reduced standing, increased feeding and drinking, and ruminating were all signs that the shades were doing what they needed to do. Pens with shades also show that there is reduced water usage by the animals within those pens, and crowding at the water troughs and splashing is also reduced in shaded versus non-shaded pens. And shade over water tanks generally also cools the water temperature that the animals are drinking. Sorry. And adoptions of shades are usually dependent, or shade use is dependent on the region and the manager's perception of what heat stress they're seeing in their animals. And again, a study out of the US showed that 17% of feedlot managers were using shade in their feedlot pens, and almost 50% were using them in their hospital pens. So the design and the construction of these shades is very important, and there's lots of recommendations you can see online, and try and base these on kind of scientific studies that have been done. So the studies that I pulled show the following: that shades greater than 2 meters squared, so 21.5 feet squared, essentially about the area of a sheet of plywood, did not improve animal production. So greater than, so you don't need very much to actually have an impact. The shade height needs to be enough so it doesn't impede farm machinery going underneath it, or airflow or heat dissipation. It's recommended that it is between 7 to 14 feet high in height to accommodate that. It benefits are reduced if cattle bunch under the shade. You want enough area so that they're not tightly packed under that shade. Permanent shades need to withstand our peak, and that's the issue in Alberta, especially southern Alberta, wind speeds and snow accumulations. There really is a lack of information on the best orientation and location to put shades within a pen. Much more research needs to be done on that. And then the return on investment, studies have shown that it's quite variable, and it depends on if, the number of high THI days and the cost of the shade and what materials you've used to construct your shades. The shade had the greatest positive effects on the animals in production in regions where there was greater than 700 hours above 29.5 degrees Celsius. Another strategy is sprinkler use, and again, I have seen it more use in terms of dust mitigation, but perhaps now people might be thinking that sprinkler use might be a way to go in terms of reducing heat stress. They really work by increasing evaporative heat loss in the animals as well as the environment. So not just on the animals, but on the pen floor as well. They're found to be most effective when the large water droplets and not kind of a fine mist, because those water droplets help to wet the skin to improve that evaporative heat loss, or conductive heat loss, and also on the pen floors helps to reduce or improve heat loss from the heat floor. Mists or too fine a spray increase humidity in the pens, but don't wet the cattle enough for the pen needed for that evaporation to occur. So other things regarding sprinkler use is the timing is important for best results, and most effective, just like the feeding, effective cooling when used early in the morning, in hours before peak heat is occurs in those pens. And the goal is really to return animals to that thermal neutral zone without creating a lot of mud in the pen, because that can create other issues. So we don't want animals walking through mud. We don't want increased fly larvae increasing because of those wet conditions. And it's recommended that those sprinklers be avoided for use in late afternoon where those temperatures are higher, which increases the humidity on the pen floor and reduces water pressure during those maximum water demand times that we've already talked about. And other studies have shown it's not necessary to sprinkle the entire pen to see positive results. I think it's one of my last mitigation strategies here is bedding. So bedding is associated with cold weather mostly, but few people think about bedding and to mitigate heat stress. What it does is it acts as a barrier to the pen floor, and it reduces thermal absorption from radiation on that pen floor. And bedded areas have been shown to be 13, almost 14 degrees lower than a bare dirt pen floor that has nothing on it. So considerable decrease in that radiant heat production from the pen floor. Bedding of any kind of straw, grass, hay, or any baled crop residue can be used. And bedding a pen should be done 1 to 2 days before a heat event, because that helps to kind of be prepared for that event, as well as reducing cattle movement and disruption on the hottest days if you have to put it in the pen at that time. Here's some data, a study out of Texas A&M, I believe. Here, this is showing just the environmental conditions during the study. Air temperature was close to 100 degrees, relative humidity at 31, wind speed at 3.6, and solar radiation at 780. When we look at the surface temperature of different materials in the cattle feeding pen, so the treatments were just the bare surface, 6 inches of wheat straw, 6 inches of manure, or 12 inches of manure, and you can really see the differences here at the bottom. That the bare floor was at 136.6 degrees Fahrenheit, similar to the 6 inches of manure, but when you add the wheat straw, you can see it goes down to 111, and even significantly different from at the 12 inches of manure. So having that higher manure pack actually helps the temperature of the pen floor. So just take home overall, heat stress is a serious issue for beef cattle welfare and productivity. We really need to improve our understanding of heat stress and its underlying mechanisms to understand better. And in our Boss Taurus cattle, our cold weather breeds, understanding that a bit more, and under our specific conditions, which can differ quite substantially from those in the US, we do tend to get more nighttime cooling. So I think it would be beneficial for us to understand what this means for our area and our region. We can focus really on identifying these mitigation strategies that I've talked about, and we can become better at finding perhaps even more appropriate strategies to our situation. And then really ultimately, we have to be conscious of this integrated approach. So understanding what the combinations of environment, animal, and management can do, and what the best strategies. Obviously, you really have to read the situation and know what you have to make best impacts or reduce the impacts of heat load in the best way you can, knowing what these mean. And then finally, just prevention and early intervention are key to helping us reduce the overall loss of productivity that we see from heat stress. So thanks for your time, and thank you for the invitation. I have my contact information here if you have any specific questions or want to talk after, and I'll be happy to take the questions now. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Karen. Okay, now we will open the floor for Q&A session. If there's any questions, please feel free to type it in the Q&A. Or if there's someone who doesn't like typing, they can always raise their hands and I can allow them to talk. Perfect. Is there anything else you want to add on? And like by the time people are typing, or there's any other questions or anything else you think is more very important?
Are you talking to me,
Yeah.
Kabir?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I wasn't sure. Um, I, I just have to say that as I've started to look more into this topic, and particularly as it relates to water, I think we know very little about our water requirements, and we think we're meeting them. If I looked into the literature about, where do these values about 2 to 4 inches per 1,000 pounds come from, and when were the last studies done on water intake and the relationship to, again, reducing heat stress, improving performance, and even immunity, vaccinations, performance, that kind of thing. We really know very little about that. And I was shocked, like I said, when I went into the literature to find that there's really not much. And we just assume that we know that. We know that they need water. We know that water is linked to rate of gain. Well, if I try and find what those studies show and what they say, I can't find them. So I think that's an area where we really need to, I know people are maybe wary, thinking, oh, now I have to expend a lot of, by changing my system, my water system. But again, it's kind of the cost of performance and the impact on performance versus that investment. I think we really need to take a closer look at that.
Perfect. So there is a question. So for thermal stress, you mentioned that it also depends on type of animal, age, breed. Do you think that if thermal stress also varies based on weight of the animal, regardless of age or type?
Yeah, so we do see that heavier animals, they have this lower critical temperature, but we often see too that, again, again, it's complicated, because if animals are given, they can habituate, and so even as they increase their weight through a feeding period, say that, you've got cattle on backgrounding the feedlot, and then through finishing, those animals, I mean, obviously they're in the finishing period during the hottest part of the year, but many times when they're at that heavier weight and they've been acclimated to those temperatures, they can manage it. So it's more an indication, or a factor of, are they acclimated to the conditions, and have you provided adequate mitigation in that period of time when they're acclimating? I hope I've answered your question.
Perfect. Are there any more questions? Yeah, let's give it another minute, and if there is no more question, then we can conclude the webinar.
Okay. And I said, if you think of something later, you can always email to
Yeah,
me or
yeah,
call me. I'd be happy to talk.
perfect. Yeah, I guess there's no more questions.
That's okay.
I guess you gave an amazing presentation then.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, very good. Well, happy to give the presentation today. I hope I've provided you with some new information. And yeah, I think we'll be hearing more about this topic in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Have you
You're you're breaking up again, Kabir. So I will stop my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you.